Hey, what's up, Rattlers? So this is the Outback of Australia here in New South Wales, and this is the habitat of what is arguably the most popular pet lizard in the world. This is the habitat of the bearded dragon. So if you've ever been curious about how your bearded dragon's wild cousins are living in the wild, what they're doing, what they're eating, what the habitat looks like, what the temperatures are like, well, come with me and let's go find some bearded dragons out here in Australia and see what they're doing in the wild so that we can better know how to care for them in our homes.
I'm Dāv Kaufman, and I tour the world to see how reptiles are living in the wild. And while I'm at it, checking out some of the most amazing facilities and reptile expos as well. It's all about learning, appreciation, and conservation. So come with me and join my Reptile Adventures.
At Zilla, we are dedicated to the innovation of caging, lighting, and equipment solutions that provide proper husbandry for your pet's long and happy life. To see our entire catalog, visit zillarules.com.
So just like it was with the blue-tongued skinks, the best and easiest and laziest way to find bearded dragons is to get in the car and cruise these roads here in the Outback, because they're going to sit on those roads and they're going to sun them. Beauty. So Rattlers, this is an eastern bearded dragon, and right now where we are out here in New South Wales, we are right on the border between the eastern bearded dragon, which is this one, and the central bearded dragon. That's the one that we all know and love from herpetoculture. And there's a few eastern bearded dragons like this one in herpetoculture, but of course the majority of the bearded dragons that we have is the central bearded dragon. And one of the differences between eastern bearded dragons and central bearded dragons is the length of that nose. Eastern bearded dragons have really long noses compared to central bearded dragons. The body color of these guys is also much more gray than the central bearded dragons are. So right now we're going to continue on down the road deeper into the Pagoda viticeps range and see if we can find one of those, because let's face it, in herpetoculture, the eastern bearded dragon is not as well known as the central bearded dragon. So we're going to go further into the Outback right now and see if we can find a central bearded dragon. Take a look at this big, beautiful central bearded dragon. This is the species that is most kept around the world, and there are so many different morphs and so many different colors and patterns and scaleless and all sorts of things, but this is what a wild central bearded dragon looks like. And one of the giveaways to tell this from the other bearded dragons here is to look at those eyes. They have orange around the eyes, and their head shape is much more blocky. It's not as elongated as, again, the eastern bearded dragon has. And look at that big dark beard that gives this lizard its name. Also, they have much flatter bodies, and the spines along the edges are much more well pronounced than on other bearded dragons. But look at the colors along his back. They look so different from their cousins that are kept in herpetoculture. And this is about the average size of a wild central bearded dragon. They do get bigger than this in the wild, of course, but they don't get anywhere near as big as their domesticated cousins in herpetoculture. So he's giving me that classic bearded dragon defense, where he puffs out his chin and reveals that big black beard that he has. But aside from fanning out that big beard and making his head look much bigger than it actually is, he'll also open his mouth and reveal that bright yellow warning colors to ward off potential predators. And again, they're going to look a lot different than their domesticated cousins simply because of the years of selective breeding of their domesticated cousins. So Rattlers, I want to hear from you guys. Comment below and let me know, do you think that the wild central bearded dragon is the most beautiful bearded dragon, or are some of the morphs that we're creating in herpetoculture more beautiful than this wild guy right here? Comment below and let me know. So he's getting a little feisty, so we're gonna let him go exactly where we found him and let him get back to what he was doing out here in the Outback. But I gotta tell you, this is one of the most awesome adventures I've had, finding a wild central bearded dragon. This is just absolutely amazing. And there's a fly in my eye. So here's a snapshot of the substrate that is found here in the Outback. You've got all these down trees like this, where they perch up on these trees. They are semi-arboreal, so trees like this they're gonna sit on top of and sun themselves. There are plenty of rocky outcroppings here that they can sit up and sun. When those rocks warm up in the sunshine, these bearded dragons will take advantage of that and sit out on these rocks and heat themselves up. So these are basically natural hot rocks. And on that note, never use an electronic hot rock in your enclosures. There is no way to control the heat that those electronic hot rocks are giving, and they can actually burn and really injure your bearded dragon. So stay away from flies and hot rocks in your enclosure. So let's have a look at this ground substrate. So it's pretty hard packed soil, but when disturbed like this, it's very fine and almost dusty. So aside from the fine dusty soil, you also have habitat that looks like this, with these rather large rocks like this. And when I kept bearded dragons, I kept them on a product that was made out of crushed walnut shells, and they never ingested that, and it was absorbent, and it made a really good substrate. So if you want to keep your bearded dragon on something that replicates this natural environment, look into that substrate that is made out of crushed walnut shells. It's even the color of the habitat out here. So if you design an enclosure that has these smaller rocks instead of a substrate, that's good too, but I would strongly suggest having both. Have these larger rocks in your hot spot so that they can collect that heat from the hot spot, and the bearded dragons can bask on these rocks. And the cool side of the enclosure, again, have a substrate that's like that crushed walnut shell product that's available commercially. But also make sure to have low-lying branches, because again, bearded dragons out here are semi-arboreal. And in your further research on what substrates are going to be best for your bearded dragon, Emma from Exotic released a bearded dragon video that is really awesome, and she talks about all the different substrates that you can use for your bearded dragon. And I'll put that link in the description below so you guys can check that out as well when you're further researching what substrates work and don't work for your bearded dragon. So it's midday right now in the middle of the Outback, in the middle of this desert, and this is what the ground temperature is at right now. You guys aren't going to believe this. 143 degrees Fahrenheit, 62 degrees Celsius. 141 over there. 145 degrees in the sunshine. So here in the shade, it's 105 degrees, which is 40 degrees Celsius. Over here in the shade, we'll take another reading, 105, 105, 108. That is a really unbearably hot ground temperature, even in the shade. So I took those temperature readings not to show you how hot to keep your bearded dragons, because if you keep your bearded dragons at those temperatures, you're not gonna have your bearded dragon for very long. But I took those temperature readings during the day here just to illustrate how unbelievably hot this ground is out here in the Australian desert. And let me tell you something, those bearded dragons, they are not out here basking at these kinds of temperatures. So crevices and boulders like like this are where most lizards out here are taking refuge from the intense heat out here. Let's do some temperature readings in here. So it's 89 degrees, which is 32 degrees Celsius. Over there, 89, 92, 90. So in the upper 80s, lower 90s is the optimal temperature for bearded dragons. And that's the temperature that you guys should have in your enclosures for your bearded dragon's hotspot. So let's talk a little bit about ultraviolet light, which is so beneficial to bearded dragons. So right now in Australia, it's the end of summer. It's just the beginning of autumn, which, you know, naturally comes at the end of summer. But consider this. The Earth is tilted at a 23.5 degree tilt, which makes it winter in the northern hemisphere this time of year, summer in the southern hemisphere here this time of year. Stay with me, I'm making a point here. The Earth orbits the sun not in a perfect circle, but elliptical, kind of like an egg. And there's a point to where the Earth is closest to the sun during that orbit, and that's in December. Well, because of that 23.5 degree tilt of the Earth, in December it is actually summertime here at the time when Earth is closest to the sun. So what that means is that Australia is being bombarded by a huge dose of ultraviolet radiation, and therefore your bearded dragons need a high amount of UV radiation. And as a matter of fact, a couple of months ago I did a video with Ryan McVeigh at Zilla, and he explained everything you need to know about ultraviolet lights. I'm going to put that link in the description below, so check out that video to learn more about ultraviolet lights and how it can benefit your bearded dragon. But again, here in Australia is the highest dose of ultraviolet radiation on Earth during the time that Earth is closest to the sun. Further west into what's called the red center of Australia. This is the classic red outback that we've all seen from all the postcards and pictures. Well, these bearded dragons out here are actually living on, well, sand. And there are these huge red sand dunes out here, and the bearded dragons are actually sitting on this sand because it absorbs that sun, and they're sitting on this sand warming up, especially here in the morning hours. So with the outback having this brick blood red color to the soil, naturally the bearded dragons are going to mimic that and be just as brick blood red as the soil around it. Look at this beautiful red-faced bearded dragon. Now, if you go just about 500 meters over, the ground color turns into this brown tan color. And if you go even further, it turns into a white color. And the bearded dragons have thus developed a colorization to match the soil that they live in. So again, this one is red because I'm standing in all this red colored soil. So how do you eat those things? They taste terrible. So there's always been that question on whether or not you should use sand in your enclosures at home. If you want to use sand for your substrate for your bearded dragons at home, it's not the best in the world, even though they are living on it out here in the outback. There are so many other commercially available substrates that you can use other than sand. But you have to keep in mind that out here, even though this ground is covered with this red sand, they are not spending all of their time sitting on this sand as they would in your enclosure at home. So where I'm standing now is where the red bearded dragons that we know and love in herpetoculture originated. And this is the birthplace of bearded dragon morphs. Because of selective breeding of different locales like red ones and yellow ones and white ones and brown ones, we have been able to develop over the decades that these have been in herpetoculture, we have been able to develop different colors and pattern mutations that we all know and love in herpetoculture today. They all started right here here with red bearded dragons from this area. So what are bearded dragons eating out here in the wild? Well, like other dragons and monitor lizards and blue-tongued skinks, all of Australia's medium to large sized lizards, they love big crunchy bugs. And there are plenty of cockroaches and huge arthropods out here that these bearded dragons and other lizards are gorging themselves on. Also out here in the outback, there's a ton of spiders, and bearded dragons love to eat those spiders. Bearded dragons will even take down those huge centipedes that are found out here. But aside from those big crunchy bugs, they also love to eat caterpillars out here. And out here in the outback, there's not a lot of butterflies and moths out here. So when they find those soft-bodied caterpillars, man, they gobble them up as a real treat, kind of like the hornworms that we feed our pet dragons. Bearded dragons are omnivores, so aside from an insect diet, they're also eating plant matter out here. Now, it's been a drought out here for 3 years, and most of these bushes, they have no leaves left on them because the bearded dragons are competing with all the other plant eaters out here, like kangaroos and feral goats and sheep, which are just everywhere around here. Also, autumn has just begun here in Australia, so it's the wrong time of year for the plants to bloom and grow those succulent flowers and those really succulent leaves. So I think that at this time of year, the bearded dragons in the wild are actually eating more insects than they are plants. But look at this bush here. There's nothing to eat on these. This has been picked dry by kangaroos and feral goats and sheep. Bearded dragons are gonna find no food on bushes like this. And these just go on and on and on. Every one of these bushes out here is completely devoid of succulent leaves. Now, it's been said in a lot of publications and in a lot of care sheets that bearded dragons are strictly diurnal. That is absolutely not true. Bearded dragons at certain times of year will become nocturnal when the heat out here is so intense that even they can't stand being out during the daytime. Now, another thing to talk about is humidity. There isn't any out here. Bearded dragons do not need high humidity. There's a lot of documentation about that bearded dragons need humidity at about 30 to 50%, which is absolutely not true for central bearded dragons. The bearded dragons found on the coast, the eastern bearded dragons, it's much more humid in that environment, and the eastern bearded dragons are the ones that need higher humidity. Out here, the central bearded dragon, they don't need that high of humidity, so about 20 to 30% humidity is perfectly ideal for your central bearded dragon. Now, there's a very good reason why bearded dragons have developed a coloration that matches the ground around them. Because let's say a sand monitor comes up to him and wants to make him into a meal. Well, what this guy will do is he will burst into a sprint and then completely dead stop. And he will flatten himself to the ground so he doesn't cast a shadow, and that cryptic coloration will make him disappear in plain sight. The monitor lizard will then run past him, and then this guy will run the opposite direction and live another day. These aren't just the world's most popular pet lizard. These are absolutely amazing creatures to be found here in the Australian outback. So, Rattlers, I want you guys to comment below. Share a tip or a technique on how you guys keep your bearded dragons so that other people can learn from you as well. And as always, like this video and share this video, and be sure to follow us on Instagram. I'm gonna have a lot of photos of this guy on my Instagram page. That link is in the description below. And until the next reptile adventure from here in Australia, love the planet, feed your reptile obsession, and rattle on.